Okay, today let's talk animals. This will be the first of 2 lectures on animals. We're going to start today with invertebrates. So what are animals? Animals are multicellular eukaryotes. There's no such thing as a unicellular animal. All the cells of animals do not have any cell walls. So fungi have cell walls made up of chitin. Plants have cell walls made up of cellulose. Animals don't have any cell walls at all. All animals are heterotrophic, meaning they have to eat things. In fact, chemically they're like the fungi in that they're heterotrophs, but whereas the fungi are absorptive heterotrophs, animals are what are called ingestive heterotrophs, meaning they have to take in food through their mouths. So where did animals come from? They came from protist ancestors like the fungi, like the plants. All right, and specifically a group of protists called the choanoflagellates. So choanoflagellates are colonial protists, and they look like this. So there are 9 different animal phyla that we'll cover over the next 2 lectures. We're going to cover 8 of them today. The 9th one we'll cover in the next lecture, because that's us. We are the chordates. We'll cover everything else today. For each of these animal phyla, you're going to be wanting to pay attention to the features that unite these phyla. Right? What do they have in common? And this is where our discussion of evolution will come in handy. Right? There are homologies that unite the features of each animal phylum. So what kind of features are we going to be paying attention to? All right, the first is how many tissue layers each animal phyla has. Most animals have 3 distinct tissue layers, the endo, ecto, and mesoderm. All right, so the endoderm is the inside stuff like your stomach. The ectoderm is the outside stuff like your skin, and the mesoderm is the middle stuff like your muscles. Right. Most of them have 3 tissue layers. There are 2 groups that don't have 3. The cnidarians only have 2, the porifera only have 1. The second feature you'll need to pay attention to is symmetry. All right, there's 2 basic body plans that you'll see in the animal kingdom. Radial symmetry, which has a central axis, and the body plan radiates out of there. So here's the central axis, and the body plan radiates out of that central axis. The second is bilateral symmetry, which means that you can only cut the animal on a single plane to create a mirror image. The third feature that you're going to be paying attention to is the gut. Right? Now we tend to think that all guts are like ours, which have, there's a mouth and an anus, and food goes one way throughout. Right? It's not 100% true. There are some animals that have a 2-way gut, or what's called an incomplete gut. They have a sac-like gut. So food goes in to an orifice, the digestion occurs in the gut, and then the waste comes out that same hole. So it's like a two-way gut. Right? So they have a mouth/anus, something that I like to call the manus. Other animals have a complete digestive system, so they have a separate mouth, separate anus. So food goes one way through here. The next feature that you'll want to pay attention to is how they develop. So there's basically 2 types of embryological programs. They're called the protostomes and the deuterostomes. The protostomes form mouth first. So as the zygote starts to develop, it eventually becomes this ball of cells. The first thing that forms is this little invagination here, these yellow cells. Right? That thing is called a blastopore. And in protostomes, that blastopore becomes the mouth, whereas in deuterostomes, the blastopore becomes the anus. Now, for reasons we're not going to talk about in our class, the embryological development has a lot to do with how many tissue layers they have. So organisms with 3 tissue layers can be protostomes or deuterostomes, but those without 3 tissue layers will not be either. The next feature is body cavity. Body cavity is called the coelom. Right, now your internal organs are actually not, your body's not solid. If I were to cut you in half, there'd be some empty spaces in there. And the empty space is called the coelom. And what the coelom does is it suspends the internal organs. And most of these animal groups will have a coelom. There's one group that we'll talk about that has what's called the pseudocoelom. The pseudocoelom is that there's a space here, right, but it's only lined on one side with the mesoderm. Right, you see how this red tissue is on both sides of the space, whereas here the red tissue is only on one side of the space. This is called the pseudocoelom. And then there's one group that has no coelom at all. You're going to see over and over as we go through the animals different body plans, right? Segmented body plans. And so there will be specialized features throughout these different organisms. Right. And the last thing you want to pay attention to is some of these animal phyla have specific features that are unique to those animal phyla. Right? So those are the things you're going to want to pay attention to. And we'll work through them as we go through today's lecture. It's also on your study guide, so you're going to want to fill that out. All right, so the first group we're going to talk about are the sponges. The sponges belong to a phylum called the Porifera. The sponges are basically barely animals. They don't have any symmetry. They don't even have any tissues. Right? They're so loose. They're just a loose association of cells. Right? They're so loose, in fact, that you can take a sponge and you can chop it up into tiny, tiny little bits until it's just a powder of cells. Put them together and they will reconstitute themselves as a sponge. The basic body plan of a sponge is this, right? So they have a body wall that's spongy because it's made up of a material called spongin. Right? But it's these pores that give them their name. Right? These pores allow water to flow into the body of the sponge. The inside of the cell is lined with these choanocytes, which you can see look a lot like those choanoflagellates. Right? So they're buried into the interior wall of the cell, the animal. Right? The tail sticks out and the tail's beat and it creates a suction. Right? And then the water that draws the water in through these pores, and the water is going to be carrying protists and things, and they get caught on these collar cells, these collars here, and that's how the sponge catches its food. And then the excess water gets blasted out this hole at the top. Right? So sponges have 0 tissue layers. They have no symmetry. They don't have a gut. They don't have anything really. Right? But those are the sponges. Not terribly interesting. The second group are the cnidarians. And the cnidarians have 2 distinct tissue layers, the endo and ectoderm, but they don't have any mesoderm. The unique feature that defines the cnidarians is that they have these stinging cells called cnidocytes. And the little harpoons that shoot out are nematocysts. They are, as you can see, radially symmetrical. And they have a 2-way or incomplete gut. And they include things like jellyfish, anemones, corals. But it's these stinging cells that unite them Right? If you ever touched an anemone, the tentacles feel rough as you draw your finger over them. And what's really happening, and the reason why they feel rough or sticky, is because as you brush along a tentacle, the cnidocytes are shooting these little harpoons called nematocysts into your finger. Now when it comes to anemones, it's not an issue because the anemones' nematocysts are not long enough to puncture human skin. But there are some cnidarians that can, right? Things like box jellies. Right? It can be very, very dangerous for humans. So the box jellies over here on the top left, as you can see, those tentacles are extremely dangerous. Other things like anemones or some other types of jellies, not particularly dangerous. But they all have those stingy cells. There's two basic body plans that you'll see within the cnidarians. Tentacles up, like an anemone, is called a polyp, or tentacles down, like a jellyfish, it's called a medusa. But they have a two-way gut, so whether you're a polyp or a medusa, the anemones will catch food and will stuff food into here, and then the waste will come back out the same hole. Right? If you're a jellyfish, you sting prey. Sting prey, draw food up into your digestive cavity, and then the waste comes out. But they have an incomplete gut. So, two tissue layers, radial symmetry, and incomplete gut. The next animal phylum are the rotifers. And the rotifers, not terribly interesting. We could skip this one. The next one that's important are the flatworms. The flatworms belong to a phylum called the Platyhelminthes, which in Greek means flatworm. As you can see here, they are bilaterally symmetrical. And this is the first of our animal phyla that does have three distinct tissue layers, an endo, an ecto, and a mesoderm. But these guys lack a body cavity or coelom. An example of a flatworm are these turbellid worms, these marine worms. And these guys are hermaphrodites. You're going to see the beginnings of organ development within the Platyhelminthes. So you can see that they have a nervous system, a digestive system, a reproductive system, but they don't have a circulatory system, right? And as a consequence, they have or respiratory system. So this flat body shape that they have is actually very highly advantageous to them because that flat body provides a lot of surface area for gas exchange to occur. Right? And the gas exchange, because it happens through diffusion, the body needs to be very flat so that the oxygen doesn't have to diffuse too far into very deep tissues. Some flatworms, not so good for you, right? You may have heard of tapeworms. Tapeworms are worms that grow in your gut, and as food passes through your intestines, the tapeworms absorb some of that food. You get tapeworms from eating undercooked beef, right? And it's because the tapeworms have this really complex life cycle. So you get it from eating undercooked beef. Tapeworm will grow inside your gut, and little pieces will fall out of your poo. Right? Now, in the era before indoor plumbing, right, if you pooed out in the field, right, and even though the rain came and your poo broke up, those little pieces called proglottids would still be in the grass. And the cow comes and eats the grass, and then it would insist in the tissues of the cow and then get passed on to the next person. But the symptoms of tapeworm infection, you basically lose a lot of weight, even though you're eating a lot. And so some people have taken that as sort of like, well, that's a good thing, right? And they have in the past used tapeworms as a dietary aid. And in fact, you can still buy sterile tapeworms, right? But this is actually not a smart thing to do, because not as far as calories are concerned, yeah, having a tapeworm is fine. But things like copper or manganese, things that are very, very low concentration in your diet, the tapeworm is going to take it first. And as a consequence, you're going to suffer these rare metal deficiencies usually. So these turbellid flatworms, I said before, are hermaphroditic, right? And so and they're not unique in this. There are other hermaphrodites out there. Things like earthworms are hermaphroditic. And normally speaking, when hermaphrodites come together, they will simply exchange sperm packets, and they'll both get pregnant. But in the case of the turbellid flatworms, they will engage in a behavior called penis fencing. When the two flatworms come together, they will both want to be the male, and they will whip out their penises and try to inseminate the other without getting inseminated themselves. Right? This is a behavior called penis fencing, and that is the real term. I did not make that up. So platyhelminthes have 3 tissue layers. They have bilateral symmetry, an incomplete gut. I'm sorry, I don't think I mentioned that. So they have a 2-way gut, and they lack a coelom. And this is our first group of protostomes. The next animal phylum are the annelids, and these are segmented worms, things like earthworms. They have a coelom, and you can see that they are bilaterally symmetrical. This is our first group of animals with a complete gut. So the annelids include earthworms, these marine worms called polychaetes, but probably one of the freakiest ones are the leeches, which are also annelids. Leeches, I think most people are aware, are blood-sucking worms, so they'll hang around in fresh water, and as mammals go into the fresh water, they will be able to detect the body heat of these mammals, and will swim over to them and then latch on, and they will just simply suck blood. They have these really, really sharp teeth. They're so sharp they can go between the nerves, so you might not even feel the leech biting you. And once they do, they'll inject you with an anesthetic so you don't feel anything, and an anticoagulant so your blood keeps flowing. And then they'll just swell up as they suck all your blood. And once they're full, they'll just drop off. Now, interestingly, leeches used to be used in ancient times for medicine, because ancient physicians used to believe that a lot of diseases were caused by an imbalance of the humors, right, the fluids of your body. Oh, you have too much bile in your blood, for example, and they would use leeches to draw out those unfavorable humors. But if you go to a modern hospital today with a trauma center, it's likely that they do have leeches. Right? So this gentleman right here has had his ear severed, and the problem is all the blood vessels have been severed. Right? You could sew it back on relatively easily, but those blood vessels, because they've been severed, that means all this tissue will die. And so what doctors will do is they'll sew the ear back on, and they'll attach leeches over here to the outside for a couple of days. And the leeches are simply drawing the blood into their bodies, and this creates a flow of oxygenated blood to make sure that these tissues out here don't die. And they got to keep doing this until new blood vessels grow. And once that happens, you're good to go. So down here on the bottom, there's a therapy. There's a therapy where people will apply leeches to their faces. And the idea is that the leeches will draw blood to the surface of the skin and keep your skin looking nice and young. Right? And because the teeth are so sharp, sharper than scalpels, they won't leave any scars. I put a picture of Demi Moore here because the rumor is that she has engaged in this therapy before. I don't know if that's true or not. So the annelids, 3 tissue layers, bilateral symmetry, complete gut, and a real coelom. Next group are the mollusks. And the mollusks are actually a very diverse group. There are some mollusks that are like an octopus is a mollusk and a clam is a mollusk. And at face value, they don't seem to have a lot in common. But the 3 things that they all do have in common is they all have a visceral mass, which is like a bag of guts, a muscular organ that's either the head or the foot, and they have a tissue called the mantle. Right? The mantle is a tissue that's unique to the mollusks, and it's a tissue that secretes the shell. Even mollusks that don't have a shell will have the mantle. So you can see that there's a wide variety of mollusks out there. The scallop over here on the left, that's a mollusk. This snail is a mollusk, and this octopus is a mollusk. So there are subgroups within the mollusks. So the clams and mussels and oysters, the guys with 2 shells, these are called the bivalves. Anything that slides on the ground like snails and slugs, abalone, these are called gastropods. And the tentacled mollusks like squid, oyster, cuttlefish, these are what are called cephalopods. So there are some amazing examples of adaptations here. This is a chambered nautilus. And the nautilus, if you look at it in cross-section, actually has a shape like an egg. Right? So if you were to look at this, if we were to turn this 90 degrees so it's facing you, it would have this ovoid shape. And the ovoid shape, if you're not aware, is very, very resistant to pressure, right? Which is great for the nautilus because it lives underwater, right? So this nautilus, because of that shape, can actually go down about 2,500 feet, right? Which is extremely deep, extreme pressure. But not all mollusks are cool, right? Snails are terrible design. The hallmark feature of the snail is the shell. But the problem is, remember, mollusks have that visceral mass, right? All the bag of guts, and the bag of guts is going to be inside the shell, right? So if you follow along, right, food goes through the mouth, it goes through the stomach, through the intestines, right? And you're going to see that the anus ends right there, which is inside the shell. So that's not a great design, right? Because the snail, as you can see here, poops on its own head. So mollusks, 3 tissue layers, right? Complete gut. They have a coelom. They're protostomes. And they include 3 separate groups, right? The snails are the gastropods, the clams are bivalves, and the octopus is an example of a cephalopod. The next group are the nematodes. Right, and this is the one group that has a pseudocoelom. They are just round worms, like not terribly interesting. Morphologically, their bodies are just basically just long, tapered worm things. But they are important worldwide because they can cause a lot of the more interesting diseases. Right, this is a man who has elephantiasis. Right, and this is the problem here is that the lymphatic system can't drain because it's been infected by nematodes. So because the leg can't drain, because the lymph node has been infected, there's basically there's a giant swelling that occurs in the one leg. All right, and that causes this very, very severe edema that's hallmark of a disease called elephantiasis. There are other types of nematode infections that you may be aware of. If you have a dog and you give your dog heartworm medication, heartworm is a type of nematode. So just like this, if there are too many nematodes in your dog's heart, it will cause a blockage and no blood can flow and your dog will die. So, here's a nematode that infects the eye. When I was in Africa, one of our colleagues had this, and as it crawled across her eye, you could see it moving across. This is how you remove it. You basically have to cut off the top layer of the eye, kind of like LASIK, and then the worm will come out. We don't have to worry about that eye worm because we don't have that here in the United States. But one worm we do have is this, which is a ascarid worm, Ascaris is the genus name. This is generally found in poorer communities. Don't get this. So nematodes are bilaterally symmetrical, have a complete gut, and it is our one group that has a pseudocoelom. The next animal phylum are the arthropods. And the thing to know about the arthropods, it is a hugely successful group. This phylum has the greatest number of species by a long shot. So like the mollusks, this one has distinct sublineages. Crustaceans, insects, arachnids, myriapods, these are all different types of arthropods. So the feature that unites them is they all have these exoskeletons, these hard exoskeletons made up of chitin, the same thing that you find in fungi, makes up the exoskeletons of these arthropods. So these are armored creatures. And they have these jointed appendages because it's like full plate armor. And as a consequence, they're very well protected and they're a very, very successful group. So the subgroups, subphyla. First group are the crustaceans. These include things like shrimp, crab, lobsters, all of our delicious friends. Right. Crustaceans are highly diverse, and scientists are finding new crustacean species, and they're estimating that there may be millions of crustacean species yet to be discovered at the bottom of the ocean. This is a new crab that was found by a joint French and Indonesian team, and I just think it's got a great name. It's called the Yeti crab. Barnacles, interestingly, were unclassified for a long time. Nobody really knew what they were. And then they realized, oh, they're kind of like a crab on its back with a shell around it. Second group of the arthropods are the hexapods, or the insects. These are our six-legged friends. And these guys by themselves are the most diverse animal group in the world. You can see if you look at all of animal diversity, insects make up more than half of all, no, not animal diversity, all of life's diversity. Scientists estimate that there may be as many as 5 to 10 million species of insects. So how can they become so diverse? It's because they have these weird faces that are made up of different mouth parts. Right? They're almost modular in their construction. And so small changes in the mouth parts means that they'll be feeding on different things, and then they become ecologically isolated from one another, if you remember that term. And as a consequence, they will speciate quite readily. They have very rapid and very complex life cycles, so natural selection can act on them at different stages of their lives. So maybe in their adult form they do similar things, but in their larval forms they feed on different plants, and that will lead to ecological isolation. The third group of arthropods are the arachnids. These are spiders, ticks, scorpions, mites, all of our nasty, creepy crawlers. And the last group of the arthropods are the myriapods. These are our many-legged friends, centipedes and millipedes. So if you're not aware of centipedes, right, this guy down here, these are the dangerous ones. These are the fast, venomous myriapods. Right? And they're defined by, see, each segment only has one pair of legs. Millipedes, on the other hand, have multiple legs per segment. Right? And they're slow, and they're generally herbivores or detritivores. So very different in lifestyle. Oops, sorry, this slide should have been up one. So the arthropods are the last group of the protostomes. Right? And they're defined by their chitinous exoskeleton. So the last group that we're going to cover today are the echinoderms. The echinoderms, they're defined by something called a water vascular system. And the term vascular is one that we encountered when we talked about plants, right? So this is a network of pipes, plumbing throughout the body of an echinoderm. So echinoderms are radially symmetrical. They include things like starfish and urchins. Right? But they all have this water vascular system. Right? So what this allows the echinoderms to do is pump water throughout their body, and they can create more pressure in certain parts of their body. And this is what allows them to move. If you've ever flipped over a starfish, you'll see those little tube feet coming out. And those tube feet, the reason they can come out is because if you imagine these are like little dropper bottles, if you squeeze here, the pressure will cause that tube feet to come out. So it's like a hydraulic system within the body of the echinoderms. So echinoderms include things like the starfish, urchins, sea cucumbers, and down here are the brittle stars. Many of them have what are called tests, which is just another name for their internal skeletons. And they're usually made up of calcium carbonate. And calcium carbonate, if you're not aware, is basically limestone. And as ocean acidification occurs because of CO2 levels are rising, create more carbonic acid. A lot of urchins are basically dissolving. Right? So those are the 8 of the 9 animal phyla. Right? We'll cover the chordates in our next lecture. And so I've included just the data from the echinoderms and the chordates all together here. So the echinoderms are radially symmetrical. Right? They are deuterostomes. Right? And then the chordates we'll talk about in animals too in our next lecture. All right.